For nearly 300,000 years, human beings walked the earth without cities rising behind them, without writing to secure their names against oblivion, without monuments to testify to their passing. Across continents shaped by ice and wind, small groups moved through vast landscapes that would never record their footsteps. No chronicles were carved into stone. No archives were pressed into clay. The overwhelming majority of human existence unfolded in a silence so complete that it resists imagination. And yet these were not creatures poised on the threshold of humanity. They were anatomically modern humans, indistinguishable from those who would later build temples and empires. They hunted beneath ice-age skies, gathered along shifting shorelines, and buried their dead with gestures that hint at memory and meaning. The question is not whether they existed. The question is why their existence is so often treated as a preface rather than as history itself. Conventional narratives of history begin only when records appear, when writing emerges in places such as Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, and human experience becomes fixed in durable form. Everything before that moment is relegated to prehistory, a term that suggests absence rather than abundance. But the absence is not of human thought or culture. It is the absence of written testimony. Archaeology offers fragments, stone tools, charred bones, pigments ground into powder. From these remnants, entire worlds must be reconstructed. Yet the farther back one looks, the more tenuous the reconstruction becomes. Organic materials decay. Coastlines that once teemed with life now lie submerged beneath rising seas. The earliest chapters of our species are scattered across landscapes altered beyond recognition. Why then does history begin only when ink meets surface? Is the emergence of writing the true dawn of civilization, or merely the point at which human complexity becomes visible to modern scholars? For hundreds of millennia, people lived, adapted, innovated, and perhaps even flourished without leaving texts behind. The silence before history is not emptiness. It is a vast, unrecorded expanse, waiting to be examined with new questions. In that silence lies the central mystery. What were we before civilization? If civilization is defined by cities, agriculture, and written law, then everything before it appears as a prolonged apprenticeship. Early humans are often cast as precursors, biological successes awaiting cultural awakening. Yet this framing rests on an assumption, that complexity begins with permanence, and that mobility implies simplicity. The central question demands closer scrutiny. What were humans before the first fields were sown and the first walls erected? Were they cognitively indistinguishable from their urban descendants, capable of abstraction, planning, and symbolic expression? Or were they constrained by a narrower horizon of thought, limited by immediate survival? Anatomically modern humans emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. Brain size and structure within this species fall well within the range of present populations. Neurological potential, in purely biological terms, appears to have been in place long before the first village. This has led many researchers to argue that the capacity for language, imagination, and complex social organization predates agriculture by vast stretches of time. Yet potential and expression are not identical. A mind capable of symbolic reasoning does not automatically generate institutions, hierarchies, or monumental architecture. The debate turns on whether early hunter-gatherers organized themselves in ways fundamentally similar to later societies, only scaled differently, or whether civilization introduced entirely new modes of human interaction. Evidence complicates simplistic conclusions. Archaeological sites reveal coordinated hunting strategies requiring planning and communication. Long-distance exchange networks suggest trust and negotiation across territories. Ritual burials imply shared beliefs about death and perhaps the unseen. These fragments point toward societies that were structured, communicative, and symbolically aware. Still, caution is warranted. Interpretations often rely on inference rather than direct testimony. A burial with grave goods may signal belief, status differentiation, or simply custom. A concentration of tools might indicate cooperation, or coincidence shaped by preservation. The material record is suggestive, not definitive. Anthropological comparisons add another layer. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer groups reveal social systems that can be egalitarian yet highly organized, governed by norms, kinship ties, and reciprocal obligations. Some scholars argue that such models offer glimpses into deep human patterns. Others warn against projecting contemporary observations backward across tens of thousands of years. At stake in this inquiry is more than a technical classification. If early humans were already socially and cognitively complex, then civilization represents not the birth of complexity, but its transformation. The emergence of agriculture and cities would then mark a shift in scale and structure rather than a sudden ascent from primitiveness. Conversely, if substantial cognitive or social thresholds were crossed only in the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, then the rise of civilization might reflect genuine innovation, a turning point in human evolution not merely cultural but structural. The central question remains open. Was civilization an awakening or an adaptation? To answer it requires examining the timeline by which complexity is conventionally measured, and the assumptions embedded within that chronology. The prevailing academic model places the emergence of civilization within a relatively narrow window of time. Around 12,000 years ago, at the close of the last ice age, human societies in several regions began to undergo transformations that would alter the structure of collective life. Agriculture appeared. Permanent settlements expanded. Social hierarchies became more visible. From these developments, the foundations of civilization are said to arise. In regions such as the Fertile Crescent, communities associated with cultures like the Natufians began experimenting with the cultivation of wild cereals even before fully domesticated crops were established. Over subsequent millennia, domestication of plants and animals intensified. Wheat, barley, sheep, and goats became integrated into systems of managed production. Sedentary villages grew larger and more architecturally complex. Storage facilities indicated planning beyond immediate consumption. By roughly 5,000 years ago, urban centers emerged in southern Mesopotamia. Sites such as Uruk display monumental architecture, administrative artifacts, and the earliest known writing systems. Similar processes, though independent in origin, occurred in the Nile Valley, the Indus region, northern China, and Mesoamerica. Agriculture supported population growth. Surplus production enabled specialization. Specialization fostered administrative coordination. Writing developed, in part, to manage this complexity. From this perspective, civilization is defined by a cluster of interrelated traits: food production, permanent settlement, social stratification, centralized authority, and record-keeping. These features, taken together, mark a threshold. Before them, human societies are categorized as bands or tribes. After them, they are kingdoms and states. This framework is widely accepted because it rests on substantial archaeological evidence. Irrigation systems, granaries, city walls, temples, and tablets inscribed with economic transactions all testify to profound structural change. The scale of coordination required to build and maintain early cities suggests levels of organization distinct from small, mobile groups. Yet even within this model, debate persists. Some scholars emphasize gradual transitions rather than abrupt revolutions. The shift from foraging to farming unfolded over centuries and varied by region. Others question whether agriculture was the primary driver of complexity, noting that sedentary communities sometimes preceded full domestication. The term, Neolithic Revolution, once commonly used to describe this period, has been reassessed. For some researchers, the language of revolution oversimplifies a mosaic of local experiments and adaptations. For others, the cumulative consequences, population density, disease patterns, territorial conflict, and institutionalized inequality, justify the designation. What remains consistent across interpretations is the recognition that, between 12 and 5,000 years ago, human societies underwent measurable transformations visible in the material record. These transformations form the backbone of the official timeline. They delineate the boundary between prehistory and history, between mobility and urbanity, between subsistence and surplus. But this timeline, though supported by evidence, also frames the inquiry in a particular way. By defining civilization through architecture, agriculture, and writing, it privileges what survives in stone and clay. The question lingers beneath the chronology. Does the absence of cities in earlier eras reflect an absence of complexity, or merely a different expression of it? Long before the first cultivated field, long before the earliest village foundations were laid, anatomically modern humans were already present on the landscape. Fossil evidence places the emergence of Homo sapiens at approximately 300,000 years ago, deep within the Pleistocene epoch, a world defined by glacial cycles, fluctuating climates, and shifting ecosystems. Early remains discovered at sites such as Jebel Irhoud in present-day Morocco reveal cranial features consistent with modern humans, though combined with traits that reflect an evolving lineage. Over tens of thousands of years, populations dispersed across Africa, adapting to diverse environments ranging from savanna to woodland. By at least 60 to 70,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began moving beyond the African continent, eventually reaching Eurasia, Australia, and much later the Americas. This expansion required more than biological resilience. It demanded cognitive flexibility, technological innovation, and social coordination. Migration across varied and often hostile terrains implies planning, knowledge transmission, and cooperation within and between groups. Stone tool assemblages from different regions show increasing refinement, with specialized blades, points, and composite tools that combined multiple materials. Yet the most striking aspect of this timeline is its scale. For roughly 95% of our species' existence, humans lived without agriculture, without permanent cities, without the institutional frameworks that later defined civilization. Anatomical modernity preceded urban life by hundreds of millennia. The human brain, in both size and structure, had reached its contemporary range long before the first seeds were domesticated. This temporal gap raises fundamental questions. If biological capacity was in place so early, why did urban civilization emerge so late? Was it constrained by environmental conditions, demographic thresholds, or cultural trajectories that required cumulative development? Or were early humans expressing their intelligence in forms that left fewer durable traces? During the Pleistocene, human populations remained relatively small and widely dispersed. Climatic instability, marked by glacial advances and retreats, imposed constraints on settlement patterns. Landscapes that were habitable in one millennium could become inhospitable in the next. Mobility was not merely a preference but often a necessity. In such conditions, large permanent structures may have offered little advantage. At the same time, the archaeological record from this deep past is inherently fragmentary. Organic materials, wood, fiber, skin, rarely survive across tens of thousands of years. Much of early human life may have unfolded in materials that leave no enduring signature. The absence of monumental architecture does not equate to the absence of social structure. It may reflect adaptation to a dynamic world. Interactions with other hominin species further complicate the narrative. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens shared Eurasia with Neanderthals and, in parts of Asia, with Denisovans. Genetic evidence indicates interbreeding, suggesting not isolation but contact. The capacity to navigate such encounters implies social awareness and negotiation across cultural boundaries. The deep history of Homo sapiens, therefore, is not a prologue defined by simplicity. It is an extended era in which modern humans lived, innovated, and endured under conditions radically different from those that later fostered cities. The vast chronological distance between biological emergence and urban civilization challenges linear interpretations of progress. It suggests that the foundations of human cognition were established long before the structures that would eventually monumentalize them. Among the most revealing traces of early human cognition are those that serve no immediate survival function. Long before fields were planted or animals domesticated, humans were making marks, shaping symbols, and engaging in practices that point beyond the material necessities of life. These behaviors, collectively described as symbolic thought, offer a window into how early humans understood themselves and their world. Cave art provides some of the most striking evidence. Beginning at least 40,000 years ago, images of animals, abstract signs, and human forms appear on cave walls across Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. These paintings required planning, preparation of pigments, and deliberate placement in locations often difficult to access. Many were created deep within caves, far from daylight, suggesting that their purpose was not merely decorative or instructional. Interpretations vary. Some researchers view cave art as ritual expression, tied to belief systems or communal ceremonies. Others argue for social signaling, storytelling, or the transmission of ecological knowledge. What remains consistent is the recognition that these images reflect abstraction, the ability to represent something absent, imagined, or conceptually transformed. Burial practices further complicate assumptions about early societies. Graves dating back more than 100,000 years sometimes include ochre, ornaments, or carefully arranged bodies. Such treatment implies attention to the dead that exceeds practical disposal. Whether these acts represent spiritual belief, social identity, or respect for the individual remains debated. Yet they indicate that death carried meaning within these communities. Body ornamentation offers additional insight. Beads fashioned from shells, teeth, or bone appear in archaeological contexts tens of thousands of years old. Some materials were transported over considerable distances, suggesting exchange networks or shared aesthetic conventions across groups. Ornamentation functions as communication, signaling status, affiliation, or role within a social landscape. Its presence implies an awareness of self and other that is both social and symbolic. Technological innovation also reflects abstract thinking. The production of composite tools such as hafted spears or arrowheads required conceptualizing an object as a system of parts assembled for a specific function. Standardized tool forms suggest teaching and learning across generations, as well as adherence to shared design principles. The emergence of symbolic behavior does not follow a single timeline. In some regions, such evidence appears earlier and more consistently than in others. This has fueled debate over whether symbolic thought arose suddenly or gradually, whether it spread through cultural transmission or emerged independently in multiple populations. Some scholars propose a cognitive revolution, around 50 to 70,000 years ago. Others argue for a deep, uneven accumulation of symbolic practices extending much further back. What these debates share is an acknowledgement that symbolic culture predates agriculture by tens of thousands of years. The capacity to imagine, to represent, and to invest actions with meaning was not a product of sedentary life. It was already present among mobile foragers navigating Ice Age environments. Symbolic thought, then, reframes the narrative of human development. It suggests that long before humans altered landscapes through farming, they were shaping inner worlds, constructing systems of meaning that bound individuals into communities. Civilization did not invent symbolism. It inherited and transformed capacities that were already deeply rooted in the human past. For much of modern scholarship, hunter-gatherer societies were described in reductive terms. Small, nomadic bands bound by kinship, possessing little hierarchy and limited material culture. This portrayal, shaped in part by 19th-century evolutionary models, positioned foraging societies at the base of a developmental ladder culminating in urban civilization. Mobility was equated with simplicity. Absence of surplus was interpreted as absence of structure. Over time, this model has been challenged by both archaeological findings and ethnographic research. Evidence increasingly suggests that many hunter-gatherer societies were neither socially uniform nor organizationally rudimentary. Their complexity often manifested in ways that do not align with urban benchmarks. Seasonal aggregation sites provide one example. In several regions, dispersed groups appear to have converged periodically in large numbers, forming temporary settlements that required coordination, planning, and negotiated access to resources. Such gatherings may have facilitated exchange, marriage alliances, ritual ceremonies, and collective decision-making. The logistical demands of assembling hundreds, or potentially thousands, of individuals imply sophisticated social networks extending across broad territories. Long-distance trade further complicates the image of isolation. Stone tools fashioned from materials traceable to distant geological sources indicate exchange networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Marine shells found far inland and exotic pigments transported across regions point toward sustained interaction beyond immediate local groups. These exchanges required trust, communication, and systems of reciprocity, mechanisms foundational to social cohesion. In some environments, abundant and predictable resources supported relatively sedentary foraging communities. Archaeological evidence from coastal and riverine settings reveals substantial dwellings, storage facilities, and cemeteries associated with non-agricultural populations. In such cases, hierarchy and social differentiation appear to have developed without reliance on farming. Grave goods vary in richness, house sizes differ. Certain individuals may have held specialized roles. Anthropological studies of more recent foraging societies demonstrate diverse political arrangements. Some emphasize egalitarian decision-making and mechanisms to prevent the accumulation of power. Others recognize leadership roles based on skill, charisma, or ritual authority. Complexity in these contexts is not measured by monuments but by systems of obligation, conflict resolution, and collective memory. The persistence of this simple band model is partly attributable to visibility. Mobile societies leave lighter material footprints than urban centers built of stone and mud brick. Organic structures decay, campsites disperse. The archaeological signature of mobility can appear sparse even when the social fabric was intricate. Debate continues over the degree to which contemporary hunter-gatherers reflect ancient conditions. Modern groups have interacted with agricultural and industrial societies for centuries, complicating direct comparison. Nevertheless, the assumption that mobility equates to cognitive or social limitation has become increasingly difficult to sustain. Reconsidering hunter-gatherer societies alters the broader narrative of human development. If complex organization, far-reaching exchange, and structured ritual life existed long before agriculture, then the rise of cities represents a reconfiguration of existing capacities rather than their inception. The absence of walls and palaces does not necessarily indicate the absence of governance, identity, or collective ambition. The conventional narrative proposes a sequence: first agriculture, then surplus, then hierarchy, and only after these, monumentality and organized labor. Yet certain archaeological discoveries complicate this linear progression. In several regions, large-scale construction appears earlier than expected, emerging in contexts where clear evidence of established farming is limited or absent. One of the most frequently cited examples is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia. Dated to the 10th millennium BCE, the site consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures. Some pillars weigh multiple tons and are carved with reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The scale of labor required to quarry, transport, and erect these stones suggests coordination beyond small, loosely organized groups. What makes the site particularly significant is its chronology. The monumental architecture predates widespread evidence of fully domesticated crops in the region. While wild cereals were available and may have been managed to some extent, the prevailing interpretation holds that large-scale agriculture had not yet been firmly established. If this dating is correct, then organized construction did not necessarily arise as a consequence of farming surplus. It may have preceded it. Interpretations differ. Some researchers propose that ritual gatherings at sites like Göbekli Tepe fostered social cohesion, encouraging larger populations to assemble periodically. Such assemblies could have intensified the need for reliable food sources, indirectly stimulating experimentation with cultivation. In this view, monumentality may have been a catalyst for agriculture rather than its product. Others caution against overstating the anomaly. Evidence of plant management and proto-agricultural practices in surrounding areas complicates any clear distinction between foraging and farming. It remains possible that the communities responsible for such constructions were already transitioning toward cultivation in ways not yet fully visible in the archaeological record. Additional sites across the Near East and beyond raise similar questions. Substantial communal structures, arranged settlements, and evidence of coordinated labor appear in contexts that blur the boundary between forager and farmer. These findings do not overturn the broader timeline of agricultural development, but they suggest that social complexity and collective ambition were not exclusively tied to fully sedentary agrarian life. Anomalies do not necessarily invalidate established models. Rather, they expose their limitations. The archaeological record is incomplete and uneven. Preservation biases favor stone over wood, monumental over ephemeral, dry climates over humid ones. What appears exceptional may reflect differential survival rather than true rarity. Still, the presence of large-scale construction prior to clear agricultural systems forces reconsideration of causality. If people could organize, plan, and execute monumental projects without the stable surpluses associated with farming, then the relationship between economy and complexity may be more flexible than once assumed. These sites do not resolve the debate. They sharpen it. They suggest that the path toward civilization was neither strictly linear nor universally uniform. Within the fragmentary evidence of deep time, certain structures stand as reminders that human societies may have experimented with forms of organization long before the conventional markers of civilization appear in the record. For most of human existence, the planet was not climatically stable. The Pleistocene epoch was defined by oscillation, long glacial periods punctuated by shorter interglacials. Ice sheets advanced across northern latitudes, then retreated. Sea levels fell by more than 100 meters during peak glaciations, exposing vast coastal plains that later disappeared beneath rising waters. Habitable zones expanded and contracted in response to temperature and precipitation shifts that unfolded over millennia, and sometimes within centuries. Human societies evolved within this instability. Migration patterns were not simply exploratory, they were often reactive. As grasslands transformed into desert, or tundra yielded to forest, populations adjusted routes, technologies, and subsistence strategies. Archaeological layers record episodes of abandonment and reoccupation, reflecting environments that could not be relied upon indefinitely. The last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, represents one of the most severe climatic phases faced by anatomically modern humans. Large portions of northern Europe and North America lay beneath ice. In other regions, aridity intensified. Yet even under these constraints, humans persisted, adapting clothing, shelter, and hunting strategies to extreme cold. The presence of settlements at high latitudes during glacial peaks demonstrates not fragility, but resilience. Abrupt climatic events further complicate the narrative. The Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,900 years ago, brought a sudden return to near-glacial conditions in parts of the northern hemisphere after a period of warming. The causes remain debated, involving shifts in ocean circulation and possibly other factors. What is less disputed is its impact. Environmental stress during this interval may have disrupted established subsistence systems, compelling communities to experiment with new strategies. Some scholars propose that climatic instability played a decisive role in the transition toward agriculture. As reliable wild resources fluctuated, deliberate cultivation may have offered a form of control in an unpredictable world. Others argue that agriculture emerged in regions where environmental conditions were comparatively favorable, suggesting opportunity rather than crisis as the primary driver. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age also obscured significant portions of early human settlement. Coastlines that once supported dense populations are now submerged. If complex communities developed along these fertile margins, much of their material record may lie beneath continental shelves, inaccessible without advanced underwater archaeology. This loss contributes to the apparent abruptness of later developments, as earlier stages may simply be hidden. Climate did not dictate human behavior in a deterministic sense. It constrained possibilities and altered incentives, but cultural responses varied by region. Some groups intensified mobility, others consolidated territories. Technological innovations, such as improved hunting weapons, storage methods, and perhaps early cultivation, emerged within these shifting contexts. The Ice Age world was not a static backdrop. It was an active force shaping demography, resource distribution, and patterns of interaction. To understand the emergence of civilization, one must consider not only human intention but environmental volatility. Stability, when it eventually arrived in the early Holocene, may have provided conditions under which experiments in settlement and agriculture could be sustained long enough to transform society. Yet whether stability enabled innovation or whether instability compelled it, remains an open question. Climate frames the stage, but it does not write the script. The transition to agriculture is often portrayed as a decisive breakthrough, a moment when humanity chose cultivation over foraging and set in motion the rise of cities and states. Yet the archaeological record presents a more complex picture. Domestication did not occur simultaneously across regions, nor did it follow a single trajectory. It emerged gradually, unevenly, and in some cases reversibly. In the Levant, communities associated with late Epipaleolithic cultures began harvesting wild cereals long before clear morphological changes indicate domestication. Grinding stones and sickle blades suggest intensive use of plant resources. Over time, selective pressures, both human and environmental, favored varieties that were easier to harvest and replant. Similar processes unfolded independently in other parts of the world. Rice in East Asia, millet in northern China, maize in Mesoamerica, and tubers in the Andes. The question is not merely how agriculture developed, but why it became dominant. One interpretation frames cultivation as an innovation driven by opportunity. As climate stabilized in the early Holocene, predictable seasons and richer ecosystems may have encouraged experimentation with planting and herding. Sedentary life allowed for accumulation of goods, more elaborate dwellings, and eventually population growth. An alternative perspective emphasizes necessity rather than choice. Population densities may have increased to the point where wild resources could no longer sustain communities without territorial conflict. In such contexts, cultivation offered a means to intensify production within fixed boundaries. Agriculture, in this view, was less a liberation than a constraint, binding people to land and labor in exchange for caloric security. Bioarchaeological evidence complicates the celebratory narrative. Early agricultural populations often show signs of nutritional stress compared to some preceding foragers. Skeletal remains indicate reduced stature, increased dental caries, and evidence of infectious disease associated with sedentary living and proximity to domesticated animals. The shift to farming may have increased total food output, but not necessarily individual well-being. Social implications were equally profound. Cultivation required investment in fields and storage facilities, creating incentives to defend territory and accumulate surplus. Land became a resource to be claimed, inherited, and contested. Surplus enabled specialization, craft production, ritual leadership, administration, but also introduced the possibility of inequality. Debate continues over whether agriculture spread primarily through the movement of people or through the diffusion of ideas and techniques. Genetic studies suggest that both processes occurred in different regions. Some communities adopted farming gradually while maintaining aspects of foraging. Others appear to have been replaced or absorbed by incoming agricultural populations. The agricultural transition was neither instantaneous nor universally welcomed. Evidence of prolonged coexistence between farming and foraging strategies suggests flexibility and resistance. In some areas, communities oscillated between subsistence modes depending on environmental conditions. Whether agriculture represents innovation born of abundance or adaptation forged under pressure remains unresolved. What is clear is that its adoption altered human relationships, to land, to labor, to time. The rhythms of planting and harvest restructured daily life, anchoring communities to specific territories and setting the stage for new forms of social organization that would follow.